There are things that appear so often that we no longer really see them. They are present in every meal, in every patch of skin beaded with sweat, in every tear that falls without us bothering to notice. And precisely because of that, sometimes we forget that every civilization has an invisible fulcrum, a tiny substance that has decided the fate of millions of people over thousands of years. Like right now, this very moment in front of you, a small jar of salt is lying quietly on the table. An object so familiar that we never ask the question, by what means has that quiet white mineral managed to stand firm through 6,000 years of storm-tossed history? If you look long enough, you will realize the jar of salt is not silent at all, despite the way it appears. It contains the memory of the very first migrations of humankind. It holds the breath of harsh winters that our ancestors once shivered their way through. It is laden with battles, with uprisings, with rituals, with oaths, and with betrayals. All of that is hidden behind those tiny crystals, glittering like fragments of cold stars. Yet when we sit in a warm, modern kitchen with soft light falling down, that little jar of salt becomes something completely ordinary. Perhaps you've just sprinkled a little salt onto your dinner. Perhaps you have used it 1,000 times without ever feeling it was worth thinking about. No one stops just to look at how those crystals shine. The salty taste has become something self-evident, like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the sun rising and then setting. But it is exactly that self-evidence that opens up a question so simple, it is almost surprising. Why was this tiny thing once guarded like treasure? Why was it once traded for gold? Why did it once cause wars? Why was it once the reason for the existence of some of the oldest roads in human history? Try to imagine lifting a single grain of salt up toward the light, so small that it is almost meaningless. And yet a single grain of salt like that could determine the survival of a human being in ancient times. Without salt, the body begins to fall into disorder. Muscles throb with pain, the eyes grow dim, the heart begins to slow down. In eras when food had no refrigerators, no chemical preservatives, salt was the only thing that could keep meat and fish through many months of winter. A mineral that today we treat as a mere seasoning was, in fact, once the boundary line between life and death. That explains why, for thousands of years, from the Sahara Desert to the snowy peaks of the Himalayas, from the salt fields along the coast to the dark, deep mines inside the earth, salt was sought with an intensity no less than gold. But if gold defined wealth, then salt defined existence. Any society that had salt was a society that could live through the winter, that could feed an army, that could expand its territory, that could settle for a long time in a single region. You might live your whole life without ever touching gold, but you cannot live for a week if you are completely deprived of salt. That is why when we look at the little jar of salt today, we are looking at an object that was once a pillar of history. But that history did not begin in empires, and it did not originate in the palaces of kings or in the pages of tax records. It began from a much simpler moment, when a prehistoric human stood before a streak of glittering white left behind after a pool of water had dried up, tasted it, and realized that this salty flavor could make their body strong again. In a certain sense, salt has always been humanity's second breath. It lies in droplets of sweat, in tears, in the blood that flows through every tiny vessel. It is the tiny currents that allow the body to transmit signals, that let the heart contract, that let cells communicate with one another. Salt is not just a mineral. It is the chemical heartbeat of life. And because of that, from very early on, humans have hunted for it by pure instinct. Yet there is something interesting. We never truly remember the moment when salt became something obvious. Perhaps it was when modern industry made the price of salt fall so low it became almost negligible. Perhaps it was the day refrigerators appeared. Perhaps it was when supermarkets stacked up bags and bags of salt that no one cared to look at closely. Salt, from the position of sovereign of survival, quietly retreated to a corner of the kitchen. But history never forgets. And so, before this 20-part journey opens up, before we return to the Sahara Desert, to the salt roads of Rome, to the deep yawning mines of Hallstatt, to the salt tax uprisings in France, or Gandhi's Salt March, we need a moment of stillness. A small pause, just enough for us to look at a grain of salt and accept that it is not as trivial as we once thought. Because only when we step back from the present, when we look at this small jar of salt in the warm yellow light of today's kitchen, can we feel the echo of thousands of years hiding behind it. And if you tilt your head and listen very quietly, you will sense that salt seems to be telling the story of itself. A story that begins not with empires, but with the deepest, most essential need for survival inside the body of every human being from the very beginning. When we move away from the little jar of salt on the dining table and return to deeper questions, we begin to realize that the journey of salt is not only the history of trade or empires, but the history of life itself. And to understand why salt was once a treasure so important that it could determine the prosperity or decline of an entire people, we must go down to the lowest layer, the biological one. The place where every civilization, every war, and every dream of humanity begins with tiny fragile signals traveling between cells. In the darkness of prehistory, when there was no fire, no agriculture, no complete language to name things, the human body already knew one truth: salt meant survival. Not because they understood the chemical structure of Na plus or Cl, but because the absence of salt created a sensation that any living creature could recognize: weakness. It was a kind of fatigue that did not come from hunger, did not come from thirst, but came from the body itself slowing down, fading like an oil lamp about to burn out. Imagine a prehistoric human walking across a vast grassland. They had no map, no compass, no lamp to light the way. All they had was their own body, signals from their muscles, the beating of their heart, their breath, and a vague yet powerful feeling that something is missing. That missing element sometimes was simply a lack of salt. And because our bodies operate through microscopic electrochemical currents, a lack of salt meant that the signals inside became erratic and no longer moved smoothly. The heartbeat became irregular. Each step grew heavier. The mind grew hazy. A person in such a condition was easily turned into prey, easily left behind in the harsh journey of survival. In an era where danger lurked everywhere, where the shadow of a predator behind a bush could end a life in seconds, anything that kept the body stronger, more alert, became sacred. Salt, in that sense, was the body's awakening. It was the source of light for the nervous system. It was the thing that helped humans run a little faster, withstand the cold a little better, react a little quicker. And sometimes that little difference was the boundary between life and death. Perhaps that is why salt entered the instinct of humanity long before it entered culture. In both sweat and tears, the body releases salt as a reminder that we are creatures who depend on salt. Deep within the folds of evolution, we were programmed to search for it. Large animals on grasslands frequently went to natural salt licks to lick the mineral. Humans followed them, not only to hunt, but also to find sources of salt for themselves. Those movements shaped the long migration routes of our ancestors. What is special is that when we look at that primal need, we suddenly understand that salt is not something humans liked, but something humans had to have. Yet what we must have often becomes what we revere. And what we revere gradually becomes what we are willing to protect at all costs. That invisible thread was precisely the reason why salt later became a strategic commodity, then a tax, a symbol of power, a justification for building fortifications or opening trade routes stretching thousands of kilometers. Pause for a moment and think about this. Long before humans knew how to farm, knew how to carve stone, knew how to tame fire, salt had already appeared in our evolutionary story as a foundation. Humans from very ancient times sensed that their bodies functioned better when they encountered saltiness. They might not have known why, but they knew they needed it. A need that never changed even as the world around them changed constantly. And because that need was connected to survival, it created a very special relationship between humans and salt. A relationship in which both depended on each other. Humans depended on salt to live, but salt only had meaning when there was a creature that understood its importance. And that interaction paved the way for everything that came next: searching, storing, exchanging, worshiping, taxing, controlling. All the later complexities sprouted from the original simple need. Salt kept the body functioning. From a modern perspective, when we understand more clearly how the body works, salt becomes even more fascinating. Because life relies on tiny electrical potentials running through each cell, and those potentials operate thanks to the difference in sodium and chloride ions. Every time we move, every time the heart contracts, every time the eyes open to look at the sky, salt is working in silence. Not boasting, not demanding attention, simply fulfilling its role. But in prehistory, when humans did not have language to write down such explanations, they only felt one thing. If they found salt, they became stronger. And if they became stronger, they lived longer. A simple relationship, but enough to change the entire course of history. And from this primal need, our next journey begins. When humans first discovered natural salt springs, those shimmering white streaks that led them to the earliest settlements, they did not yet know that they were laying the foundation for the next step in civilization. But every story begins with a need. And the story of salt begins with that ancient primal need. When we understand that the need for salt is not a habit but an instinct, we begin to see more clearly how salt called humans toward it from the earliest moments of our species. And if we step even deeper, passing through the misty veil of prehistory, we will encounter the first footprints leading to ancient salt springs, places where the white mineral was not just matter mixed into the soil, but a signal of life, a faint glimmer of light in a world full of danger and scarcity. On some distant morning long ago, when the sun had not yet become a symbol, when the sky had no name, a small group of prehistoric humans wandered across dry grasslands. They followed large herds of animals, partly to hunt, and partly to find places humans themselves could not locate on their own, the marshes and muddy basins that could keep them alive. No one had taught them that salt was necessary. They only knew that the strongest, most resilient animals often sought out the dry, hardened white patches at the edges of wetlands to lick. And in the most natural way, humans followed them. One of the oldest images that archaeology has reconstructed of this journey comes from the natural salt springs of East Africa and the Middle East. When water evaporated under the sun, salt crystallized into small white patches, covering the ground like a dusting of pale light. Those white fragments did more than reflect sunlight. They reflected something deeper, a silent invitation to creatures craving salt. The prehistoric humans bent down, tasted those shimmering crystals, and realized that the salty flavor made them more alert, made their bodies feel lighter, eased the ache in their muscles. In that moment, for the first time in history, humans knew that salt was good for them, not through words, but through sensation, through intuition, through the changes they felt in their own bodies. Those ancient salt springs became gathering points of life. Imagine small groups of people scattered across a vast natural world, gradually returning to the same place. Each time they came back, old footprints overlapped with new ones, forming faint paths across the grasslands. Those paths turned into trails. Trails became meeting places. And wherever there were gatherings, there were shared fires, shared food, shared stories, and eventually the earliest forms of culture. Many archaeologists believe that salt, not fire, not agriculture, was one of the very first reasons humans stayed in one place long enough to encounter one another regularly. Because salt was rarely scattered everywhere. It was a concentrated resource. It pulled humans together, creating intersections in a world where everything else was vast and sprawling. And places with salt often attracted many wild animals. This made the salt springs both dangerous and full of opportunity. Every approach was a gamble with life. A single careless moment could turn a human into prey. And yet they still came, because their bodies needed salt the way plants need sunlight. Another curious thing is that salt always accompanies water. Salt springs usually emerge from mineral-rich underground aquifers, and when the water evaporates, the salt is revealed. So humans soon understood that where there was salt, there was water. And where there was water, there was life. These small realizations gathered over time, slowly forming humanity's first living map of the world. Through thousands of years, these salt locations gradually shaped the earliest communities. Not cities, not villages in the true sense, but prehistoric way stations. Places where people came to gather salt, to hunt, to share knowledge, and then moved on, but always returned. Salt, in that way, became the invisible thread binding humans into a network even they did not recognize. Some recent studies show that regions with traces of ancient salt almost perfectly align with the migration routes of our ancestors. This means that as humans left Africa, crossed the Middle East, and spread into Europe and Asia, they did not only follow prey or climate, they followed the trail of salt. Those tiny white patches became natural compasses, guiding an entire species toward its future. And when we look back at those ancient salt springs, we cannot help but think of something both familiar and strange. Salt lies at the boundary of earth and water, of life and exhaustion, of what remains and what disappears. Perhaps that is why humans, from very early on, felt that salt was the purest essence of the earth, born from the heat of the sun, the flow of water, and the patient waiting of time. At this point in history, salt was not yet a treasure, not yet white gold, not yet taxed, not yet a reason for war. It was simply the thing that kept humans alive. But like everything in nature, anything tied to life would soon become the center of power. And from those humble ancient salt springs, the story will lead us to an important turning point. The moment when humans learned not only to find salt, but to keep it, store it, and then discover that salt could preserve food for much longer. A moment that would transform the entire course of history. The ancient salt springs had guided our ancestors to the first gathering points, but another unexpected moment had to arrive before salt truly became a key that would change history. A moment that happened not beside a shimmering spring under sunlight, but beside the carcass of an animal in the cold of a long afternoon, when winter was drawing near and hunger lingered like the shadow of a predator behind the bushes. Prehistoric times had no clear days or dates. There were only cycles of the sun, of the rain, of scarcity. When the cold arrived, the entire world seemed to shrink. Large animals migrated, trees stood bare. Fresh meat, the greatest prize for humans, lasted only a few days before decaying. A tribe might manage to hunt a large deer at the end of autumn, but if it was not eaten within a few days, the rest would rot, attract predators, and turn joy into danger. In such circumstances, salt entered the story as a coincidence tinged with destiny. Imagine a group of prehistoric humans standing around the animal they had just brought down. They cut deep into the red flesh, dividing pieces to carry home. Blood soaked into the soil. The smell of fresh meat drifted in the cold air. But when they placed some pieces of meat near a salty patch of ground, perhaps on a rock coated with white crystals or near a dried salt basin, they noticed something strange. Meat placed on salty ground did not spoil as quickly as meat placed elsewhere. It may have begun as pure accident, a piece of meat falling into a salty patch, another piece laid on a rock bearing a thin layer of salt. But those who lived by observation understood that small difference immediately. In their harsh world, anything that extended time by even a few days was a miracle. And that miracle was salt. No one at that time understood the concept of absorbing moisture. No one knew about bacteria or chemical reactions. All they saw was that salt made meat drier, firmer, longer lasting. It changed the smell, it changed the color, and most importantly, the meat was still edible after many days. For the first time in history, humans could hold back time. That was the gift salt offered them, a chance to resist the brutal cycle of feast and famine. Once they understood this, humans began using salt not just to lick or replenish their bodies, but to preserve the life around them. Salt became the bridge between autumn and winter, between days of plenty and the long months of hunger. From that moment, salt changed its place in human life. It was no longer something found along the way. It became something humans actively sought out, gathered, divided, and guarded with the same care as fire. Because without salt, those tribes could not store, could not prepare, could not survive the cold season. Salt, the tiny thing we sprinkle on our food today, was the reason humans first conceived of storing food. And storage was a great leap forward. It was the seed of settlement. When humans realized they could keep meat for many weeks, they no longer had to wander constantly. They had a reason to stay near salt sources longer, to pitch shelters, maintain fires, assign watches. Places with salt began to turn into temporary homes, from temporary homes into settlements, and from those settlements, the first communities slowly emerged. Time flowed very slowly then, but bit by bit, salt changed the entire way humans lived. A tribe with salt could survive the winter. A tribe without salt could collapse. That tiny difference created the life or death gap between groups of people, a gap that would later become differences in power. Perhaps the most remarkable thing in this period is the way salt changed how humans viewed death. When our ancestors learned they could keep meat for many days, that they did not have to kill another animal immediately, they began to see what they hunted not only as food, but as a form of solidified time. Salt, in that sense, was the tool that helped humans stop running so desperately from death looming right in front of them. From there, salt gradually entered rituals. A pinch sprinkled onto meat before drying in the sun, a simple motion filled with reverence for the thing that helped them survive. Salt became a worldly miracle, not one belonging to gods, but to nature, to the sun, to the earth, to water. Later on, as primitive tools were created, sharpening stones, bone knives, ropes, humans learned to preserve more effectively. They dried meat on salty rocks, hung it on wooden frames near salt sources, and gradually discovered that the more refined the method, the longer the preservation lasted. These techniques, over thousands of years, would evolve into the art of drying meat and fish, and later into ham, salted fish, fish sauce, and hundreds of other forms of preservation. But at the dawn of civilization, when humans did not yet know how to write or forge metal, salt taught them an important lesson. Life could be extended if one knew how to listen to nature. And from that lesson, salt would lead them to the next steps: great civilizations, ancient empires, fiery salt kilns, and trade routes stretching to the horizon. But before reaching those empires, we must pass through another stage, when salt began to be seen through sacred eyes, entering the world of rituals, mythology, and the power of the earliest civilizations. When humans understood that salt could hold life in place, could stretch time across seasons of hunger, they began to look at salt with different eyes. Not merely as a mineral, not merely as a salty taste on the tongue, but as something capable of pushing death away. And when a substance can challenge death itself, it is no longer just a resource. It becomes a symbol, a ritual, a form of power. In the early dawn of ancient civilizations, salt seeped into every layer, into the Nile River, into the clay tablets of Babylon, into the rising heat of China's ancient salt kilns. Though each place had a different history, they all met salt at the same point, the boundary between survival and extinction. In ancient Egypt, where the sun blazed like fire and the Nile became the spine of the kingdom, salt was seen as a material belonging both to life and to death. The Egyptians used natron, a natural salt rich in sodium carbonate, to embalm bodies. In the cool chambers beneath the pyramids, the bodies of pharaohs were covered in that white mineral. Natron absorbed moisture, absorbed odor, slowed decay, as if preserving the final outline of life before the soul crossed into another world. In the silence of the tombs, salt became the doorway between two realms. It was no coincidence that the Egyptians believed the soul could not endure unless the body was preserved, and the only material capable of achieving that over the long days of the embalming ritual was salt. Through this, salt entered Egyptian religion as a tool of the gods, carrying the salty taste of preservation, the breath of the sun, the strength of the earth. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the cradle of writing, the Babylonians saw salt as part of a covenant. On ancient clay tablets carved 4,000 years ago, archaeologists have found references to bread and salt. In Babylonian society, when two parties shared salt and bread, they considered themselves to have entered a sacred binding relationship. For in the ancient world, sharing salt meant sharing life. From this belief arose the idea of eating salt together as an oath of loyalty, a promise that could not be broken. Salt was also used in protective rituals against evil. People sprinkled salt around their homes to repel harmful spirits. In a world where the boundary between nature and the divine was always blurry, salt became the thin wall shielding humans from the darkness. What is striking is that Mesopotamia was extremely poor in natural salt. It was this scarcity that made salt a precious commodity, carried along boats on the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, controlled by temples and royal palaces. Not only daily life, but political power itself revolved around the control of this white mineral. Across half the globe, in the distant east, ancient China also stepped into history under the mark of salt. If Egypt used salt to preserve bodies, and Babylon used salt to bind people together, then China saw salt as the foundation of economy and governance. Archaeological sites in Sichuan show that salt kilns existed more than 2,500 years ago. The Chinese learned early how to drill deep into the earth to bring up brine, then boil it in large furnaces to produce refined salt. In the heat of those salt kilns, an entire industry was born. Chinese historical records note that the earliest dynasties levied taxes on salt to sustain their treasuries. Salt taxes became a stable source of revenue, feeding armies, building fortresses, expanding administration. In China, salt was not just a biological necessity, but the backbone of the nation. An empire that controlled salt was an empire that could control its people. Some dynasties considered salt so important that they created entire government departments devoted to it, setting strict rules for production and distribution. To them, salt was a national treasure, a substance that could not be allowed to slip from the hands of authority. When we place these three civilizations side by side, we see something strange yet perfectly logical. Whether in the dry lands of Egypt, the clay plains of Babylon, or the mountains of China, salt became the center of life. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was rare, though sometimes it was, but because it was tied to the thing every society feared losing most: existence itself. In each civilization, salt not only saved people from hunger and cold, but carried a deeper layer of meaning. It was the symbol of endurance, of preservation, of order, of all the things humans wished to hold on to in a world that constantly slipped away. From the preservation of pharaohs' bodies to the oath of bread and salt, to China's salt taxes, salt became the connection between life and power. Embedded within those tiny crystals were invisible threads binding humans to one another, through ritual, through trade, through law, through belief. And as ancient civilizations began to expand, exchange, and trade, salt would step out of its symbolic role to become the backbone of an entire infrastructure. Roads, caravans, transport routes, paths that would eventually lead to one of the most prominent empires in history, Rome. As ancient civilizations gradually shaped their identities, salt had already become an indispensable substance in daily life, in belief, and in power. But it was not until a certain pivotal moment in history that salt was placed at the very center of an entire vast empire, where every road, every law, and every army carried its mark: the Roman Empire. Not many people today remember that one of the earliest roads Rome ever built was not intended for marching armies, not for territorial expansion, but solely for transporting salt. That road was called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. And from it, a massive network of roads would spread across Europe, connecting millions of people under a single arch of Roman authority. Imagine Rome in its early days, a small town by the Tiber River, sparsely populated with a rudimentary economy. But Rome had one great advantage: proximity to the sea and to coastal salt flats where pure, valuable salt could be extracted. In a world where preserving food meant survival, having a reliable source of salt meant possessing time, stability, and the ability to feed an army. The ancient Romans soon realized that salt was not just a seasoning, but a strategy. And for strategy to function, they needed roads. The Via Salaria was built to transport salt from the coastal regions deep into inland territories. Caravans of mules, soldiers, and merchants traveled this route daily, carrying loads of small white crystals that nourished an entire city. Wheels wore down the stones, creating echoes that affirmed the existence of an empire growing from grains of salt. But salt did not flow only along stone roads. It flowed through every pulse of Roman life, and the place where we see its imprint most clearly is in the Roman army, the most feared military force of its time. The familiar word salary comes from the word sal, meaning salt. Roman soldiers were paid partially in salt or in money valued according to a specific quantity of salt. This was not because Rome lacked other resources, but because salt was a stable medium of payment, easy to trade, and instantly useful. A soldier with salt was a soldier who could eat, could preserve his food, could survive long, cold marches. When we look at this, we see that salt contributed to Rome not only economically, but militarily. An army regularly supplied with salt could march farther, conquer wider, and maintain cohesion better. Few people realize that during long campaigns lasting months or even years, salt was no different from blood flowing through the machinery of war. These needs forced Rome to develop a strict system for managing salt. Salt mines were placed under direct state control. Merchants had to obey strict regulations. Salt prices were regulated not only to generate revenue, but to maintain social stability. Because the Romans understood clearly. If salt became scarce, the people would grow resentful. If salt was hoarded, the economy would falter. If salt was used as a political weapon, the empire would lose its unity. The wisest rulers in history always knew that power came not just from armies or precious metals, but from the things that kept their people alive every day. Under the Mediterranean sun, salt lay quietly like white sand. Yet that quietness was exactly what made it the invisible pillar of Rome. From the meals of common citizens to the rations of soldiers, from religious rituals to national economy. Something else remarkable happened during this era. Salt became a global commodity in a way no earlier civilization had managed. Rome controlled ports, sea routes, and camel caravans, turning salt into a product capable of moving from North Africa to Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Middle East. Those tiny crystals became the white threads binding continents together. In the regions ruled by Rome, people began to rely on Roman salt not only for its quality, but also for its safe, coherent distribution network. Once again, an empire endured not because of the glamour of victory, but because of the stability of everyday necessities. Looking at the full picture, we see something strange. Salt guided Rome into an era where they built roads not just to conquer, but to deliver salt to the places that needed it. The stones of the Via Salaria were the foundation of a Roman philosophy, an empire sustained by consistency, preparation, and the ability to turn the ordinary into an instrument of power. Salt, during the Roman era, was no longer merely a mineral tied to survival. It became the architecture of power, something invisible yet present in every decision, every route, every meal, and every marching army pounding the earth with metallic rhythm. And as Rome expanded, salt would continue to create long trade routes like the arteries of the ancient world. Those routes, stretching from the Sahara Desert to the Danube Valley, would soon ignite into the first global trade network in human history. When the Roman Empire built its first roads, they had no idea that those modest beginnings would open an entirely new era in world history, an era in which salt, not gold or silk, became the quiet substance connecting far-flung territories. The networks of exchange grew wider and denser until from the cracked Sahara Desert to the humid coasts of Southeast Asia, salt appeared like a shared message, a language that required no written script. If we look back at the map of the ancient world, we can see routes of movement that were never marked with arrows, but marked instead by the shadows of camel caravans, by the murmurs of sailing ships, and by the deep footprints of merchants. All of them moved toward a single purpose, bringing salt from where it existed to where it did not. In North Africa, the story of salt became an epic filled with red dust and scorching winds. The trans-Saharan caravans, sometimes stretching hundreds or even thousands of camels, moved across lands of sand without a single tree in sight. Guides wrapped their faces in cloth, their eyes narrowed under the harsh sun. They carried massive blocks of salt, square and solid like stones used to build pyramids. Their weight was heavy enough to bend the backs of even the strongest camels. But for the tribes of West Africa lacking natural salt, those blocks were not just goods, they were life. In places like Gao, Timbuktu, and Tagaza, salt was precious enough to be traded at equal value for gold, not because they misunderstood the worth of gold, but because they understood the worth of salt. Gold was beautiful, salt saved lives. With every change of season, caravans would leave the northern salt mines, cross endless waves of red dunes, and reach the trading cities of the south, where salt was exchanged for gold dust, ivory, spices, textiles, and political influence. These routes were not written into history books with ink, but with the endurance of those who risked their lives to bring salt to places thirsting for it. Farther east, aboard large wooden sailing vessels, Indian and Southeast Asian merchants used the monsoon winds to carry salt across the Indian Ocean. It was a world of salty water and wide skies, where salt was not only transported as crystals, but also harvested directly from the sea and dried on the hot sand of sheltered coves. Along the coasts of Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Indonesia, salt fields as smooth as mirrors appeared very early. Sunlight scorched the shallow water, leaving behind white crystals that sparkled like the skin of giant fish drying on the shore. Those places were not just production sites, they were meeting points, crossroads for ships, Arab merchants anchored to trade spices for salt. Southern Chinese traders brought ceramics to exchange for salt used as food and medicine. Sea routes and land routes intertwined into a network that every civilization, knowingly or unknowingly, became part of. For the ancient kingdoms of Central Asia, salt became the factor that kept them independent among fertile lands. Along the Silk Road, salt was transported by donkeys and horses, crossing cold valleys, climbing snowy passes, passing through fortresses and oases where merchants rested. Many cities grew wealthy not from silk or spices, but by charging fees on caravans carrying salt. Those tiny grains became reasons to build defensive walls, form military patrols, expand marketplaces, and enlarge caravanserais. In Europe, beyond ancient Rome, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic communities understood that salt was a strategic resource. Great rivers like the Danube, Rhine, and Vistula became ideal transport routes. Wooden boats filled with sacks of salt drifted downstream, carrying the salty taste to cities along their banks. Nobles who controlled those river ports often grew wealthy and gained political influence. Their power, though rarely stated openly, was tied to ownership of salt mines or salt routes. In that context, salt became a form of common language across the world. Even though each civilization spoke a different tongue, used different scripts, worshipped different gods, they all understood the value of salt. When two merchants met in a distant port, they might not understand each other's words, but they understood the weight of a block of salt, the grimace at its taste, the look in the eyes of someone who needed it. Salt was a kind of measurement unit acknowledged by every civilization, and because salt was tied to life, to food, to winter, to war, it naturally created mutual dependency. A land lacking salt would turn toward a land with salt the way plants turn toward sunlight. A land abundant in salt became a commercial center, the anchor point for invisible currents of movement. In times when the world's map was still fragmented and incomplete, salt quietly stitched it together. The trade networks powered by camels, by oars, by hardened feet turned salt into the rhythm of the ancient world, quiet, steady, unshowy, but indispensable. Everywhere salt flowed, it left traces. A larger market square, a busier port, a stronger army, a deeper mine, a newly opened road. Not because salt desired such things, but because humans needed salt to survive. And where the need to survive exists, a road will always emerge. Morning in the ancient Alps often began with a thin layer of mist draped over the gray limestone peaks, where sunlight took a very long time to break through. In that pale light, a large mountain stood silent, as if guarding something. From afar, it appeared like an enormous, lifeless block of stone, but as we moved closer, we could sense its own quiet breaths, the cold wind rising from deep crevices, the damp mineral scent clinging to the air, and a thick silence that felt as though no one had disturbed it for 1,000 years. Inside that mountain lay Hallstatt, one of the oldest salt mines ever exploited by humans. If we let our gaze travel deeper, following the dark tunnels, we would see the torchlight reflecting against the salt-lined walls, creating shimmering patches like stars trapped beneath the earth. In those narrow spaces, ancient miners worked, their breaths mingling with the mountain air, their rough hands leaving traces on every slab of stone. Hallstatt was not a place of haste. It was a place of patience. Every step in the darkness carried a faint echo, sounding like the whispers of those who had walked there before. And when we looked closer at the rocky walls, the clear crystals of salt seemed to hold the gazes of the miners who had spent their entire lives chiseling each fragment from the heart of the mountain. A single swing of the pickaxe, seemingly ordinary, carried the weight of all ancient Europe. In the small crack of breaking stone, We could hear the rhythm of communities that depended on salt to survive winter. They knew that every piece of salt carried home was not merely a commodity, but time. Time for meat to dry, time to endure hunger and cold, time to continue living. There are rare moments in history when nature reveals its true face to humanity. Hallstatt is one of them. When archaeologists first dug into the forgotten layers of soil, they found bodies preserved as if they had died only days before, hair still intact, clothing still present, even the expressions on their faces frozen in the final habits of life. Salt had kept them, not as memories, but as time capsule letters sent to the future. If we focus on one tiny detail, a strand of hair dried, gently curled, clinging to a crust of salt, we can feel more clearly the preserving power this mineral possesses. No fire, no elaborate techniques, only salt and time. Salt drew out moisture, removed odors, slowed every process of decay. It resembled a cold but gentle hand, holding on to what the world above had forgotten. And when we widen our gaze, the tunnels gradually appear like the branching veins of a giant creature, each level connected to another, as though humans had burrowed into the mountain's heart in search of the white light that the surface could not give. In that darkness, salt was no longer just a resource. It became a form of frozen memory, not the memory of individuals, but of an entire culture. The miners who lived in Hallstatt did not merely work with salt. They lived with it, breathed with it, let it envelop their entire lives. The small village at the mountain's foot existed because of the mine. Children grew up hearing the sound of pickaxes echoing from underground. The elderly passed away with the smell of salt still clinging to their hair. It was as if their destinies were bound to this white mineral, cold but full of life. If we lift our eyes from the underground shadows, we see that Hallstatt was more than a mine. It was the center of a trade network so vast it is almost unbelievable. From here, salt traveled over mountains, down valleys, along the Danube and the Rhine, spreading across Central Europe. Backpacks filled with salt could be traded for furs, amber, metals, and weapons. Small markets sprouted along the routes like the footprints salt left on the map. Hallstatt gave people of that time the feeling that they were extracting not only a mineral, but power. The power to store, the power to trade, the power to organize a community. All of it originated from the silent white crystals hidden within the rock. From afar, they looked ordinary, but up close, they carried an entire civilization within them. There were moments when, in the flickering torchlight of the tunnels, a miner would suddenly stop. He would look at the glittering salt wall, feeling as though he were being watched by countless eyes from the past. Hallstatt, in its own way, had turned salt into a convergence point of time, life and death, labor and rest, memory and forgetting. Perhaps it is because of this strange interweaving that Hallstatt holds a special place in the history of salt. Not only because the mine was rich, not only because the trade network grew from it, but because it showed humanity something simple, that sometimes the most important stories lie deep underground, where light rarely reaches. And when we step out of the dark tunnel and look up at the mist-covered mountain, we understand that salt does not only preserve food or bodies, it preserves a part of history, a part that is quiet, unshowy, but enduring across millennia. There are moments in history when salt was no longer simply a mineral. It became the boundary between freedom and control, between the survival of the people and the power of those who ruled them. If we look closely at those tiny grains of salt, we see only ordinary sparkling crystals. But when we widen our view to the societies of the ancient and medieval worlds, salt appears as an invisible tether binding people together. A form of power that is hard to grasp but always present. As kingdoms and empires began to form, they quickly realized a simple truth. Whoever controlled salt controlled the people. For a person might live a lifetime without gold, but no one could live without salt for even a week. In every meal, every winter, every military march, every act of healing, humans needed that salty essence. Rulers soon understood that salt was not just a resource, but an instrument of governance, a tool sharper than any sword. Let us move closer to a tiny moment in history, a morning in a poor village where townspeople stand in line to buy salt from the state's storage. They carry small leather pouches, their hands gripping the few coins they possess. The smell of sweat and soil mixes in the air. When the tax collector opens the lid of the salt jar, the white crystals appear, gleaming under the sunlight like a cruel reminder. Their lives rest entirely in the hands of the man behind the wooden table. From that moment, salt became a tax, a special kind of tax because it did not target wealth, but life itself. Salt taxation appeared in many civilizations: China, Rome, the Arab kingdoms, the African dynasties, and later in medieval Europe. But everywhere it carried the same color: fear. Not fear of the tax itself, but fear of a prolonged salt shortage, something capable of killing an entire village in just a few months. Wise governments built salt tax systems that were tight like nets. Tyrannical governments tightened salt the way one tightens a hand around a throat. No army was needed to intimidate. All they had to do was lock the salt storehouse. When we take a wider view, we see why salt became a political tool. It was concentrated, easy to control, and difficult to replace. Most importantly, it forced people to depend on the state. Inland populations could not produce salt by themselves, and even in coastal regions, the act of evaporating seawater could be forbidden, taxed, or regulated. From afar, the world map of that time looked like a network of glowing dots, places where salt was distributed by the authorities. Between those glowing points lay the dark regions where people waited for salt shipments as if waiting for relief aid. Each shipment brought relief. Each delayed shipment brought anxiety. Power had never been so close to the everyday lives of the people. But what made salt taxation a dark chapter in history was not only scarcity, it was inequality. The rich always found ways to access salt, paying higher prices, stockpiling, or bribing officials. The poor had only one path: paying whatever tax the state imposed, even if it drained them to the bone. In years of crop failure, salt taxes became even heavier because the need to preserve food increased. Poor families had to choose between buying salt or buying grain. And when winter came earlier than usual, the wrong choice meant death. Look closely at a poor family trying to gather enough money to buy a small bag of salt. A child stands behind his mother, eyes lifted toward the white crystals for the first time. He does not know that this substance will decide the coming winter. He only sees his mother's trembling hands holding the salt as if holding the last piece of their lives. Scenes like these played out across countless ancient kingdoms, and every small scene added together to form an undercurrent that would eventually lead to greater upheavals. And so salt created a new profession: salt smuggling. From the forests of China to the Arabian grasslands, from the coasts of Africa to the ports of Europe, daring individuals transported salt by night through forests, along hidden paths to evade soldiers. They traded their lives for gold, or sometimes simply for the right of others to live. Salt smuggling was the voice of desperation, the natural response to the tightening grip of authority. We must widen our view to see the strange truth. The salt tax, created to strengthen the treasury, became the seed of instability. It sharpened social divisions. It made citizens distrust their rulers. It deepened resentment in regions far from the center. And from these quiet resentments, great uprisings would begin to smolder. Salt, once a life-saving mineral, was now becoming a symbol of oppression. And when we step back and see the entire picture, we understand that this was a critical turning point in the story of salt, the moment when human power began to carry a salty taste, and salt became a tool of rule, not nourishment. India is a land where history often moves like a vast procession of people, mysterious, heavy, and filled with long, weary breaths. Great empires were born here, rivers flowed like lifelines, nourishing millions, and the monsoons came and went, forming the unique rhythm of the subcontinent. Amid all these immense forces, salt, a substance so small it is easily forgotten, held a role far more ruthless than we might imagine. During the Mughal era, salt became the foundation of power, not because the Mughals enjoyed its taste, but because they understood the absolute dependence of the people on salt. The deep inland regions had no sea, no natural salt sources. The coastal areas were tightly controlled by officials. To make people obey, one only needed to control what they could not live without. In 17th century Bengal, the sight of men carrying salt along dirt roads felt like watching lives being tied to an invisible string. The bags they carried were heavy, not only with mineral, but with tax. Every step was a reminder that salt, born from seawater, no longer belonged to nature. It belonged to the empire. Tax stations rose everywhere. Mughal guards stood before salt warehouses with expressions both alert and cold, as if protecting the greatest treasure of the empire. Poor families had to bring most of their meager possessions to these stations, exchanging them for a few handfuls of salt to stay healthy and survive the winter. A small pouch of salt, passed from hand to hand, felt like life being returned to them, but with a price that made the buyer swallow hard. If we look into each household, we see salt as a constant worry. A farming family in Bihar or Bengal might spend an entire season storing grain, but they always knew grain only mattered if they had salt to preserve it. When the monsoon arrived, early or winter lasted longer than expected, a little salt could determine whether they survived the next half year. That tiny substance became a blade hanging above their heads. Then another power arrived, and everything turned even more cruel. When the British East India Company began expanding its influence, they quickly realized the absolute value of salt in controlling the population. The merchants in red coats, carrying the laws of an empire, did not come merely to buy cloth, tea, or spices, as stories usually say. They came to tighten their grip on salt. They established a monopoly so strict it made even the Mughals step aside. All salt produced within the territory was heavily taxed. All salt transported had to carry permits. Even coastal villagers were forbidden from collecting natural salt left behind by the tide. The crystals born from the sun and sea breeze were declared the property of the company. In small markets, people secretly exchanged packets of salt wrapped in banana or palm leaves. Sellers feared being caught by British guards. Buyers feared being fined. A tiny packet of salt cost so much that a poor family had to skip meals. Some mothers pulled off their old scarves to trade for a little salt, their eyes filled with fear, yet holding no other choice. Such scenes repeated everywhere, from Bengal to Orissa, from Madras to the villages along the Ganges. In places where salt fields once glistened in the sun, there now stood guard posts preventing villagers from reaching the very resource their ancestors had relied on. The white fields lay silent, like pages torn out of history. The British called it economic administration. But for the people, it was chains. On a broader scale, we see that the salt monopoly created deep social divisions. Merchants grew rich by cooperating with the company. The middle class struggled but endured. And the poor, the vast majority, became those who lived in fear of running out of salt before winter ended. Thus, salt smuggling became both dangerous and widespread. Hidden forest trails appeared at night. The soft rumble of cartwheels carrying salt moved through the darkness, footsteps hushed to avoid waking the guards. Salt smugglers were not merely earning a living, They were carrying life to regions deprived of it. To villagers, they were saviors. To the British authorities, they were criminals. Both perspectives were true in their own way. Among all of this, one image makes history painfully clear. A poor woman sitting before her dark kitchen hearth, gently scraping the final grains of salt from the bottom of a jar, her hands trembling not from cold but from knowing that tomorrow the jar might still be empty. Behind that small gesture lies an entire system of oppression stretching across generations. Salt was born to preserve life. Yet for centuries in India, it became the thing that preserved injustice, an injustice created by those in power who saw salt as a tool, not as a human necessity for survival. In ancient France, where wheat fields stretched all the way to the horizon and villages sat quietly along the banks of the Loire, salt once appeared in the kitchen as something ordinary. But ordinary did not mean free, because here, salt carried a name that made society tremble for centuries. Gabelle, the salt tax. Salt was nothing more than tiny white crystals. But when rulers saw in it the ability to force an entire nation into submission, salt immediately became heavier than gold. And in France, where the monarchy constantly needed money for wars, for palaces, for the extravagance of court life, the gabelle became one of the sharpest tools for tightening control over the people. If we look at an ordinary day in the life of a 17th or 18th century French villager, we see that salt was no longer a seasoning. It was a burden. In small hearth-lit kitchens, mothers sprinkled salt into soup with the care reserved for something rare. A handful of salt could cost nearly a full day's wages. Many poor families could not even afford proper seasoning, resigning themselves to bland meals year-round. What made the gabelle cruel was not just the high tax, but the way it sliced France into regions of privilege and regions of suffering. In some areas, people could buy salt cheaply. In others, the price was so high they had to sell belongings just to survive the winter. On the map, France looked like a body cut into pieces, each piece bearing its own fear of salt. But the most unjust aspect was this. Citizens were required to purchase a specific amount of salt every year, whether they needed it or not. The law decreed that every adult must buy the state's quota of salt. They could not buy less. They could not refuse. They were forbidden to make their own salt. The mineral that once sustained life now became proof that the people were being forced to pay simply to exist. And when a law runs against the natural rhythms of human life, it always creates its own detours. In France, that detour was called contraband, salt smuggling. In the forests along the Loire, narrow trails became places where daring groups exchanged salt at night. They hid salt in sacks of flour, in baskets of eggs, in their clothing. Some smugglers were merely desperate farmers trying to save their families from hunger. Others became professionals, quick, silent, moving like shadows. They knew every shortcut, every guard post, every suspicious sound on the road. If we imagine a small village at midnight, we might see a faint light glimmering from a remote house. Inside, a man opens a small bag, revealing salt crystals mixed with grains of sand. That was not just salt. It was hope. It was stubborn defiance against a system trying to control even the people's meals. But the gabelle did more than create smuggling. It created resentment. A slow-burning resentment, like small embers, warm, persistent, never fully extinguished. In markets, farmers whispered about new tax rates. In taverns, curses against the crown slipped out as the wine flowed. And in the poorest homes, where meals were nothing but thin soup, silence became the loudest voice, the silence of discontent. The deeper we look into the lives of French villagers at that time, the clearer it becomes that the gabelle was not merely a tax. It was a symbol of inequality, of distance between crown and people, of exhaustion before a law justified by nothing but power. In the great cities, those with wealth and privilege never felt the weight of the salt tax. They always had salt, had special exemptions, had quiet pathways around the law. But in rural villages, where people had nothing but their hands and their land, the salt tax became a daily question. Is my life worth protecting in the eyes of the crown? If we imagine a pot of soup boiling on a small stove, steam fogging the air, we see a painful truth. The very seasoning that makes food flavorful was something the poor could afford only by sacrificing part of their lives. And from that injustice, the first murmurs of resistance began to form. No one can point to the exact moment when the French people shifted from endurance to anger. Perhaps it was a whisper at the market. Perhaps it was the empty stare of a mother looking at an empty salt jar. Perhaps it was the tear of a father who could not buy enough salt for his child's meal. These small moments gathered together opened a larger path. And when an empire begins to shake, it is never the swords that strike first. It is the smallest things. A loaf of bread not salty enough, a jar of salt too expensive, a meal that reminds the people they are ruled by those who have never known what it feels like to run out of salt. For decades, the Gabelle became a crack running through the heart of France. A quiet crack, but deep. And eventually, it was no longer just a crack. It became an opening through which a seismic force would rise, beginning with the smallest voices, spreading to the great public squares, where people dared for the first time to demand the right to live without salt tightening around their throats. There are minerals found in stone. There are minerals born from the sea. But salt is the only mineral that crosses the boundary of matter to enter the world of ritual and spirit. From the sun-scorched lands of the Middle East to the quiet wooden temples of Japan, salt appears not as a seasoning, but as a prayer. No one knows exactly when salt became a symbol. Perhaps it was when people first realized salt could push back death by preserving meat. Perhaps it was when they saw salt purify water, remove odors, and hold on to a kind of cleanliness nature always tried to maintain. And then, almost naturally, salt became something purifying, a presence of safety, as if within those salty crystals lived a faint light the human eye could not fully see. Step into an ancient Jewish home where a mother is preparing Sabbath dinner. On the table, a loaf of challah sits beside a small dish of salt. When the family gathers, they will dip the first piece of bread into salt before eating. The gesture is gentle, simple, yet deeper than it appears. In the Torah, salt is considered a lasting covenant, something that cannot be destroyed with time. Sprinkling salt over offerings or dipping bread into salt is a reminder that humans are keeping an old promise, a promise to God, to the community, to one's own soul. In that sense, salt becomes a bridge between the worldly and the unseen. Looking more broadly at Jewish culture, we see salt everywhere, in prayers, in the purification of rooms, in rituals after childbirth. Each time salt is used, it carries the atmosphere of protection, of warding off what should not come near. Not superstition, but a belief that salt is the remaining purity from the dawn of creation. On the other side of the world, in ancient Catholic churches, salt appears in the most solemn moments. Before holy water is sprinkled, it must first be mixed with salt. Those salty drops placed on a believer's forehead do not only represent the washing away of sin, but protection itself. Salt helps water live longer, stay unspoiled, remain undefiled, a powerful image of endurance that faith wants to impress upon the human mind. Look closely at medieval baptism rituals, and you will see the priest placing a pinch of salt on the lips of the newborn. The hint of salt touching the tongue serves as a declaration that this child has stepped into the world of light, guarded from the shadows outside. A tiny mineral, yet with a role weighty enough to open the path for the soul. And not only in the West, Eastern traditions saw the depth of salt too. In Japan, at Shinto shrines, salt is placed at the entrance as an invitation to purity. Two small cone-shaped mounds of salt sit on either side of the doorway of restaurants, shops, even private homes. The Japanese believe salt can repel impurity, keeping the space clean both in spirit and in air. In sumo, before each match, wrestlers throw salt over the ring. The grains fly into the air and fall like white rain. It is not a theatrical act, but a plea. Let this ring be a fair place, untouched by ill fortune. In that moment, salt is the boundary between triumph and misfortune, between the sacred and the mundane. In many rural regions of Japan, salt is placed inside small cloth bags and hung at the entrance to ward off bad luck. But if we look deeper, we see it is not blind fear, but trust in nature's cleansing power. Salt is not a magical relic, it is simply the embodiment of purity. Expand our view to the whole of Asia, and salt appears in dozens of rituals, sprinkled around the home during ancestral rites, placed under a child's pillow, mixed with ashes in prayers for peace. From India to China to Southeast Asia, salt is what people use to mark the boundary between what is good and what is harmful. The strange thing is that salt never proclaims itself sacred. That sacredness is something humans have assigned to it, not through imagination, but through lived experience. When salt kept meat from rotting, when it purified water, when it saved people from poisoning, when it soothed wounds, ancient people saw in it a sign of protection. Salt became a symbol, not because of legends, but because of its natural function. If we sit quietly in a still room and hold a pinch of salt in our hand, we may feel the layers of meaning salt has carried for thousands of years. Not only its taste, not only its chemistry, but a sense that it holds stories passed down from generation to generation, stories of protection, of purity, of the soul's resilience against the hardships of life. In that way, salt is not merely matter. It is humanity's collective memory of its need to be protected, purified, and held close to what is good in a world full of turmoil. In the imagination of many, the Sahara is nothing more than an endless sea of sand, where the wind blows so fiercely it can erase every footprint in minutes. But if one places a hand on that scorching sand and listens to the stories of the past, they will discover that the Sahara was once one of the most important trade crossroads on the planet. Not because of gold, not because of silk, but because of salt. For a span of centuries, in this harshest place on earth, massive slabs of salt the size of half a human body were loaded onto camels and carried like precious stones. They were not secondary goods. They were assets valued as highly as gold, sometimes even higher. Salt in the Sahara was not merely a mineral, it was the heartbeat of life. If we move closer to a morning in Tahaza, one of the Sahara's most famous salt mines, we would witness an extraordinary sight, houses built from salt. White walls, white roofs, even the ground covered with thick layers of salt, as if reminding visitors that this place does not belong to the world of greenery and water. People here lived by salt, breathed with salt, and when they left, they abandoned behind them a ghostly white town like the skeleton of the desert. From Tagaza and other salt mines, enormous salt blocks were cut using crude tools, then shaped into rectangular slabs so heavy that it took 2 men to lift one. Placed on the backs of camels, these slabs became the building bricks of ancient international trade. And from here, the longest, most dangerous journey of salt began. Trans-Saharan caravans could stretch into hundreds of camels. Imagine a long procession of silent animals walking across the sand, each carrying 2 or 3 huge blocks of salt tied with leather straps. The sand beneath their feet burned. The wind blew so hard it blurred everything ahead. The guides wrapped cloth around their faces, revealing only their deep, dark eyes, shielding themselves from the brutal sun and the dryness that could drain moisture from flesh. Amid that landscape, the white salt slabs stood out like relics from a forgotten civilization, misplaced into a world of scorching sun and burning sand. Why was salt treated like gold? The answer lies in the needs of the people of West Africa. In places like Timbuktu, Gao, and the lands of the old Mali Empire, salt was desperately scarce. People lived in a hot climate, sweating heavily, their bodies losing salt constantly. They needed salt to live, to preserve food, to heal, to maintain health. So when camel caravans from the northern Sahara arrived with salt, they were welcomed as bearers of life. Gold in Mali was so plentiful that it was said Mansa Musa, the famed king, was so wealthy that every time he went on pilgrimage, the price of gold dropped across the Mediterranean. But having gold did not mean having salt. And for the people, even the power of a king could not replace those tiny white crystals. Salt became equal to gold. A large block of salt could be exchanged for an equal weight of gold. If we imagine a moment of trade in ancient Timbuktu, we would see a North African merchant placing a slab of salt in front of a West African merchant. The other would place a leather pouch of gold on the opposite scale. Both silent. No rituals, no bargaining. Two substances standing as equals, two halves of survival. One, the sunlight condensed into precious metal. The other, the ocean's breath crystallized into white grains. Each quiet transaction was the heartbeat of West Africa's economy for centuries. But caravans did more than carry salt. They carried the story of the Sahara, a story every grain of sand knew. Salt was the only reason this land could connect with the outside world. Without salt, there would be no desert routes, no thriving oases, no bustling market towns scattered like lifelines across the sea of sand. And if we look at the lives of the caravan guides, we see this bond clearly. They traveled thousands of kilometers, rationed water drop by drop like gold, slept beneath a sky so vast it made humans feel impossibly small. In return, they brought back gold, furs, slaves, ivory, spices. But the most important thing was still salt. Salt made their existence possible. They were the ones who carried the sea's saltiness into lands that thirsted for it. In one scene at the edge of the Sahara, a child touches a salt block for the first time. He is surprised that the salt is cooler than the sand. He tastes it and immediately knows it is something his body always needed. In that small moment, we understand that the value of salt does not come from trade, but from the deepest needs of life itself. The longer we look at the Sahara, the clearer it becomes that salt was not merely a commodity. It was a connection between different worlds, a reminder that at certain points in history, the most ordinary things became the most essential. In the nighttime darkness of the Sahara, when the wind makes the sand run like ocean waves, a caravan guide sits beside a small fire, gazing at the rows of salt blocks. Not everyone understands what they are guarding, but they know a truth shared by every civilization of the time, that it was salt, not gold, that formed the heart of life in this land. The history of war often speaks of swords and spears, fortresses, bloody battles, and heroes who fell on the field. But if we widen our gaze to what stands behind those battles, the granaries, the field kitchens, the marching columns of soldiers pushing through the freezing winter, we find a quieter truth. Many wars were not decided by steel, but by salt. An army might have the bravest warriors and the most brilliant generals, but without salt, they could not travel far, could not store provisions, could not maintain strength through long campaigns. In war, salt was not a seasoning. It was the boundary between life and death. On every march, armies carried dried meat, smoked meat, salted fish, all dependent on salt. And when the salt supply ran out, meat rotted faster than troops could move. The stench rising from supply carts was not only the smell of spoiled food, but the smell of a looming defeat. If we step into a winter military camp of the Middle Ages, we would see wooden barrels filled with salted meat stacked side by side. Inside, the meat tightened, dried, coated with salt so thick it looked almost encased in ice. Soldiers opened each barrel carefully, knowing every edible piece meant another day of survival, another chance to reach the front without collapsing from hunger. But salt did not only preserve food. Often, it preserved the soldiers themselves. On long marches, especially in hot climates, soldiers lost salt rapidly. Skin dried out, vision blurred, limbs trembled. Entire armies throughout Roman, Persian, and even Asian dynastic records were said to have collapsed, not from arrows or swords, but from salt imbalance. Historical documents tell of troops exhausted after only a few days, solely because they lacked enough salt in their rations. And there were moments when salt became strategy. Fortresses under prolonged siege often faced salt shortages. Without salt, food could not be preserved. Meat spoiled, disease spread, morale collapsed. A city might withstand an enemy's armies, but not the combination of hunger and a diet without salt. During medieval sieges in Europe, attackers cut not only the water supply but also the salt supply. They knew that when salt stores ran dry, a fortress would fall faster than any weapon could force it. Walls might withstand catapults, but they could not withstand rotting food. In the histories of India, China, and the Middle East, blocking salt routes was often the first move in weakening an opponent. And in West Africa, there were times when kings even controlled the price of salt to force reliance, making it easier to mobilize armies. There were also moments when salt was the spark for war. When a state tightened salt taxes too harshly, revolt followed. You've seen this in France with the gabelle. But elsewhere, Han China, Mughal India, Edo Japan, salt taxes fueled unrest. When salt became a luxury, the people starved. And when the people starved, they no longer feared swords. If we look closely at a small moment within an uprising, a poor family staring at an empty salt jar, or a soldier discovering that the last salted meat has spoiled, we understand that war often begins not on the battlefield, but in the kitchen. In coastal salt works, where steam rose under harsh sunlight, workers dried salt not just for winter, but for the military campaigns ahead. That white salinity traveled with armies over mountains and rivers, through storms, through exhaustion. It was present in hurried meals, in the leather pouches on soldiers' belts, in supply depots guarded with absolute vigilance. In a corner of 17th century Europe, some armies refused to fight in winter simply because they lacked enough salt to preserve food. During the English Civil War, both parliamentarian and royalist armies fought for control of coastal salt warehouses. Skirmishes broke out solely to seize a storehouse holding a few barrels of salt, because those few barrels determined the endurance of thousands. Then came the age of Napoleon, and salt again entered strategy. His empire imposed strict salt taxes to fund war, making civilians suffer, but giving the army steady supplies. In long campaigns, through rain and cold, salt-preserved meat and grain allowed his troops to march astonishing distances. If we stand closer to a field hospital, we see salt playing another role: cleansing wounds. Salt water, though painfully stinging, washed out dirt, blood, and prevented infection, one of the greatest killers of soldiers before antibiotics. Thus, small bags of salt in military medical stores became as valuable as bandages or surgical knives. Looking more broadly, salt did not merely accompany war, it often underpinned victory. An army with sufficient salt was an army that could survive the days when weather, disease, and hunger tried to destroy them before the enemy even arrived. History tends to highlight grand heroic pages, clashing battles, dramatic turning points. But in the long, silent stretches of war, there were tiny moments: the sound of a salt barrel's lid being opened, the scrape of a knife removing salt-encrusted meat, the quiet sigh of a soldier relieved to know tomorrow's ration still exists. Placed beside the drum beats, the hoof beats, the clashing steel, these small sounds reveal that war was sustained by the most ordinary things: Salt, in its quiet way, saved more armies than any general ever did. For thousands of years, salt lived the life of a precious but difficult to access mineral. Humans had to descend deep into mountains, toil under the sun on vast salt fields, dig with their hands, carry loads on their backs, and trade their lives for each block of white crystal. But when the world entered the age of steam, steel, and machinery, a new truth slowly emerged. Salt was leaving the worn hands of history and stepping into an entirely different era. The Industrial Revolution did not only change how people wove fabric or forged iron, it changed the way they perceived even the most ordinary things, and salt, once fundamental but quiet, became one of the substances most dramatically transformed. If we stand beside a salt field in the early 19th century, we would see a different scene from that of millennia before. Instead of laborers bending under the sun, raking salt with wooden tools, many places began to use water wheels and steam-powered pumps to push seawater into evaporation ponds and machines to stir, dry, and separate the crystals. The hands that once worked mercilessly under scorching heat were replaced by tireless iron gears. If we look more closely at a newly built industrial salt works, we see that the change lies not only in the visuals, but in the soundscape. No more wind scraping across sand, no more slow footsteps of manual salt harvesters. Instead came the long hiss of hot vapor, the roar of steam boilers, the clang of metal shovels hitting the bottoms of giant pans. The rustic cadence of traditional saltcraft had shifted into the rhythm of machinery. The way humans sought salt also changed. Instead of relying solely on sun and wind, people drilled deep into the earth to extract brine from mineral veins and ran it through artificial evaporation systems. In England, Germany, France, Poland, and the United States, drilling wells hundreds of meters deep became commonplace. People discovered that beneath the earth lay prehistoric oceans of salt, buried through geological ages, accessible only to those with sufficiently powerful technology. In these rising industrial zones, steam pipes crisscrossed like networks of veins. Brine was pumped upward, fed into enormous boilers, and heated with coal. The steam rose in thick white clouds that enveloped entire workshops, giving the sense of standing in a salty rain. Salt, once dependent on sun and seasonal winds, now depended on machines that never slept. At the same time, salt transport was transformed. Small riverboats and slow horse-drawn carts gave way to railways. Soot-blackened train cars carried salt through the night, from mines to cities, from rural areas to factories. A journey that once took weeks now took only hours. Distance shrank. Prices fell sharply. Salt was no longer a rare treasure. It became an everyday commodity. But this shift brought consequences that the history of salt had never seen. As salt became cheap and abundant, the power of those who once controlled salt began to crumble. Many kingdoms lost their source of salt revenue. Noble families once enriched by salt mines lost their advantage. Communities built around traditional saltcraft were pushed aside as their ancient trade could no longer provide income. In coastal salt villages, workers stood at the gates of new industrial plants, watching quietly as machines performed the tasks their families had done by hand for generations. Their eyes held both wonder and loss. A craft passed down from father to son was replaced within a few years by metal gears without emotion. But we must also look wider to see the undeniable benefits. As salt grew cheaper, the quality of life for the poor improved dramatically. No more days of eating bland food because salt was unaffordable. No more fear of food spoiling for lack of salt to dry it. Salt deficiency diseases dropped sharply. Densely populated cities could store more food. National armies gained more reliable salt supplies, allowing them to maintain strength over larger territories. Salt shifted from being a strategic substance to a daily essential, and that shift softened the social structure in ways few recognized. At the same time, salt began stepping into new fields. Chemists realized salt was the raw material for countless important compounds: soda, chlorine, metallic sodium, bleach, fertilizers, dyes. With the chemical industry booming, salt became a foundational building block of modern manufacturing. In a 19th century European laboratory, we might see a young scientist heating a salt solution in a test tube, observing tiny color changes that would lead to new production processes. Those discoveries turned salt into an industrial raw material rather than merely a food item. Salt entered soap, paper, disinfectants, textiles, and even glassmaking. From a mineral that once belonged in kitchens and battlefields, salt stepped into factories and laboratories. And like every substance touched by industrialization, salt became a symbol of deep transformation. The shift from tradition to technology, from manual labor to mechanical work, from scarcity to abundance. Salt changed humanity not only through its taste, but through the way it reflected the evolution of civilization itself. If we pause for a long moment before an industrial steam boiler of the 19th century, listening to the boiling water, the forceful hiss of steam, the steady turning of gears, we can clearly see this truth. Salt had left the ancient world and entered the age of steel and coal. And once it crossed that threshold, it never returned to what it once had been. There are moments in history so small they seem to carry no weight at all. A bundle of dry grass in the wind, a handful of ashes, a grain of salt picked up from the ground. But sometimes, these tiny moments change the fate of an entire nation. India in 1930 lived under the shadow of the British Empire, a shadow long and heavy. The salt tax, the levy that had pressed upon the people for generations, still tightened around the throats of hundreds of millions. Not only did the British tax the production of salt, they forbade the people from collecting it from the sea, forbade them from taking salt from the earth, forbade even the simple act of picking up crystals washed ashore. These prohibitions would have sounded absurd if they were not tied to the reality that millions of poor Indians could not afford the salt they needed to live. Salt, born of the sea, was declared the property of the empire. In that setting, Gandhi appeared not with swords or an army, but with bare feet and a simple idea. If the law forbade people from taking salt from the sea, then let us go together to the sea to take salt, not to wage war, but to remind the world of a natural truth. The land belongs to the people. The sea belongs to the people. And so does the salt. Gandhi chose to begin at Sabarmati, a quiet place with a gentle riverbank. On the morning of March 12, 1930, he stepped out of the ashram gate holding a wooden staff, his frame small, but his stride firm. The group behind him was initially just about 70 people walking along a dusty road. But with each village they passed, the procession grew longer. Some left their work behind. Some brought their entire families. Some intended to walk only a few kilometers, but kept going, as if their feet were pulled forward by an invisible force. The 380-kilometer journey felt like a small stream slowly merging into a river. By day, the marchers walked under fierce sunlight, their steps steady on the dry earth. By night, they slept beneath the stars, the wind carrying the scent of soil. Gandhi spoke with them, not through grand speeches, but through closeness, through the belief that their footsteps were rewriting a story stolen long ago. In the quiet stretches of road, one could almost picture Gandhi walking between two lines of supporters. He would bend down to pick up a straw, a dry leaf, or simply brush dust off the path. These small gestures carried great meaning. Gandhi constantly reminded people that change did not always require thunderous actions. Often, it began with the ability to see injustice in the most ordinary things, and the greatest injustice then came from salt. As the march approached the sea, the sound of waves began to replace the sound of wind. The salty air blew strongly, the moisture clinging to clothes and skin. The vast sea came into view like a horizon that no imperial law could ever truly control. Villagers lined the roads, many bursting into tears simply at the sight of the procession. To them, this march was not just a protest against the salt tax, it was the voice of dignity. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi stepped onto the beach at Dandi. The sand was wet. The wind blew hard. He bent down and picked up a small white fragment of salt, just one gentle motion, as if picking up a pebble. But when he stood upright, that grain of salt in his hand carried the weight of an entire nation. The gesture made no sound. There were no drums, no cheering, only thousands standing still, watching him. But within that silence, a boundary was erased, the boundary between ruler and ruled, between submission and defiance. After that moment, India ignited. Tens of thousands began making salt illegally, drying seawater on rooftops, boiling it down until only white crystals remained. Poor women, weary men, artisans, young students, all joined in, not because they were literally starving for salt, but because they wanted to reclaim what was theirs. The British responded by arresting tens of thousands, including Gandhi himself. But the more they arrested, the stronger the movement grew. Those taken into custody saw their handcuffs as proof that they no longer bowed their heads. Those who remained free continued making salt. Every grain of white crystal became like a snowball rolling down a mountain, gathering the strength of a nation. A tiny mineral exposed the frailty of an empire that had seemed unbreakable. There are moments in history when you can hear a people awakening, not through gunfire, but through the soft rustle of salt crystals drying on coarse cloth. When that sound rose from millions of rooftops, it shook the machinery of rule. Salt had once saved humans from winter, preserved meat for war, and kept bodies intact for 1,000 years. But at Dandi, salt did something else. It preserved a nation's will. The will to say that life should not be taxed, that the sea belongs to the land belongs to the people, and the salt, born of both, cannot be owned by those who stand outside the history of that land. From the beach at Dandi, that wave spread, and from its spreading, an empire began to crack. Perhaps no mineral has passed through as many identities as salt. In prehistory, salt was life. In the ancient world, salt was power. In the medieval age, salt was political burden. And by the modern era, salt had taken on a completely different image. The accused standing before the court of nutritional science, a substance white, salty, dangerous. But to understand this transformation, we must return to the small laboratories of the 19th century, where scientists first separated sodium and chlorine and then asked, what happens when the body has too much or too little salt? If we look at a test tube containing a salt solution, we see only a colorless liquid, nothing remarkable. But to a physician of that time, it was a window into the secrets of the human body. They saw that sodium-controlled nerve transmission regulated blood pressure and maintained fluid balance. They discovered that salt was not merely a seasoning, but the chemical language through which cells communicate. A living body is a body that knows how to use salt to generate its own electrical potential. And from that understanding, salt entered medicine with a new identity, the solution that sustains life. In European hospitals of the early 20th century, saline solution was the cheapest yet most precious medicine. A doctor holding an IV bottle of salt water held in his hands the patient's chance to survive fever, dehydration, or exhaustion. Salt water entered the veins, helping the body reclaim the balance it had lost. It was the moment salt became a temporary, artificial bloodstream. At the bedside, drops of saline fell rhythmically, quiet but powerful, each one reminding the body how to stand again. But as science advanced further, that quiet reverence was replaced by new questions, new doubts. People began measuring blood pressure, recording numbers, comparing those who ate more salt with those who ate less. Gradually, salt, once a hero, became a culprit. In medical journals, new lines appeared. Salt increases blood pressure. Salt burdens the heart. Salt is dangerous to health. To many, these sentences felt like a verdict delivered upon something humanity had depended on for thousands of years. In Western supermarkets during the 1970s, 1980s, people began looking at salt with suspicion. On television, doctors advised reducing salt intake. In newspapers, salt was called white death. In many households, the salt jar was pushed to the far corner of the kitchen, like a criminal exiled from the center of the meal. A swift reversal of roles. But when science dug deeper, the picture began to adjust. Large studies showed that the body does not react to salt as simply as we thought. Some people are salt sensitive, others are not. Some bodies handle salt as a natural component of life. Others retain salt due to genetics or underlying illness, and most importantly, too little salt is just as dangerous as too much. If we stand inside an ICU, we see this clearly. A patient with hyponatremia cannot stand upright, cannot think clearly. A soldier in the desert lacking salt will grow dizzy, convulse. An athlete collapsing from salt loss may fall right on the track. The human body does not fear salt. It fears imbalance. In a modern nutrition clinic, doctors explain this to patients using small models. A cell, a semi-permeable membrane, arrows pointing in and out. The body retains salt to retain water, retains water to maintain blood pressure, maintains blood pressure to sustain the heart. It is an unbreakable chain. Every missing or excessive link causes disorder. Slowly, the view toward salt matured. People began to understand that salt was not the enemy. The problem lay in the modern world, where processed foods contain levels of salt far beyond the body's natural needs. Salt was not at fault. Industrial life created an unbalanced diet. If we look at a city tonight, neon lights reflecting on fast food signs, we see salt being pulled into a new life, its role no longer that of salt in warfare or salt in rituals, but the salt of packaged foods. Salt is used to flavor, to retain moisture, to extend shelf life. Salt is overused not because people need salt, but because industry needs convenience, and so salt takes the blame. But if we quietly return to the kitchen of an ordinary family, a pot of soup simmering, a mother sprinkling just a pinch of salt between her fingers, we understand that the nature of salt has never changed. It is still what balances the body, still what gives food its soul, still the mineral that has accompanied humanity since the dawn of time. Science helps us see more clearly, not to condemn, but to understand that salt, like everything else, must be used in the right amount, in the right way, in the right context. The body does not want too much salt, nor can it withstand too little. The body wants moderation. It wants to be listened to. In an age where people fear salt, rely on salt, avoid salt, and seek salt all at once, one truth remains unchanged. Salt is still the foundation of life, in both its chemical sense and its deeper historical meaning. An ordinary mineral, yet always a mirror reflecting our attitude toward our own bodies. If we stand inside a large supermarket on any afternoon, we will see shelves packed with goods: bread, sausages, cheese, instant noodles, canned food, snacks, sauces, frozen items. These products look completely different, come from different cultures, and are made by different corporations. But if we listen closely, there is one invisible thread connecting them all: salt. Not the salt of ancient times, not the salt of the Sahara or the empires, but the salt of the age of industrial food production, the mineral that now powers an entire global supply chain, just as oil powers the energy sector. In the modern world, salt is not only for seasoning. Salt is a flavor enhancer, preservative, stabilizer, texture modifier. It helps cured meat keep its pink color, helps bread develop a crisp crust, helps cheese form a smooth structure, helps instant noodles last for years without spoiling. Salt performs the quiet labor of maintaining order in the world of fast food and packaged food. If we look inside a food processing plant, we will see a scene utterly different from the old salt fields. No longer sun-bleached drying yards, but stainless steel production lines where salt is measured by machine, sprayed as fine mist, dissolved into solutions, or mixed with dozens of other ingredients. Salt crystals are treated like industrial materials, moving through warehouses, pipes, and precise dosing systems calibrated to the thousandth of a gram. In that space, salt is no longer a household ingredient. It is the infrastructure of the modern food industry. Global consumer goods corporations, from the United States, Europe, Japan, to South Korea, rely on salt as the backbone of their products. Take a packet of instant noodles. Salt is not only in the seasoning packet, it is inside the noodle strands, in the broth powder, in the layer of flavoring dust on the surface. Open any bag of snack chips and the white powder on your fingers carries a strong, salty taste. That is not an accident or habit, it is strategy. Salt stimulates the palate, keeping consumers wanting to eat more, buy more. In that sense, salt is the fuel of the industrial food sector. But to satisfy that enormous demand, salt must travel through a logistics network stretching across the entire planet. From underground salt mines in Canada, Poland, and Germany, from coastal salt fields in Mexico, China, and India, from refined salt factories in the United States or Japan, the flow of salt crosses continents. Cargo ships carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of salt travel across oceans, dock at industrial ports, enter warehouses, then get divided into smaller loads bound for food factories. If we stand at an international port watching containers open in unison, we would see salt treated like a strategic raw material. It is measured in tons, in containers, in contracts dozens of pages long. On commodity exchanges, salt may not be as prominent as oil or wheat, but its supply chain is so large and stable that entire nations depend on it. And then, salt enters the products present in nearly every modern meal. The ubiquity of packaged foods means salt appears in places people do not expect. Sauces, lightly salted beverages, sweet biscuits, even chocolate. Salt creates contrast in flavor, making food taste rounder. For this reason, the food industry treats salt as a tool of consistency. Every product must taste the same, whether produced in the rainy season or the dry season, in Factory A or Factory B. Quietly, salt has become the adhesive binding the global food industry together. Looking deeper into economic value, salt is even more than that. It is the raw material for the chemical industry, producing chlorine, soda ash, PVC, detergents, dyes, water treatment agents. Salt enters metallurgy, textiles, pharmaceuticals. A glass factory needs salt. A leather processing plant needs salt. A production line for eye drops needs salt. Salt exists in thousands of products consumers have never thought about. But beneath this scale lies a paradox. In the modern world, salt makes people both dependent and afraid. Dependent because salt makes food tastier, longer lasting, easier to transport. Afraid because excess salt in processed diets poses health risks, especially as industrial life pulls people away from natural home cooking. In busy urban households, dinner often happens quickly, with processed food making up much of the meal. Salt, therefore, enters the body not from the kitchen salt jar, but from supermarket meals. A slice of pizza, a bowl of instant noodles, a sandwich, each contains more salt than we imagine. Modern humans do not fear natural salt. They fear invisible salt. The more we study the food industry, the clearer it becomes that salt has become a new kind of fuel, cheap, effective, everywhere. Like oil, salt drives far more systems than people realize. A small change in salt prices can ripple through thousands of factories and millions of meals. Salt once traveled from ancient springs to battlefields, from rituals to empires, from salt pans to steam engines. Now it travels through conveyor belts, through containers, through supermarket chains. Salt remains salt, but its role has expanded into a vast network upon which the global economy now depends. And if one day that supply chain were to stop, we would see more clearly than ever, no matter how the modern world changes, a single grain of salt can still make everything tremble. Throughout most of history, salt entered the human story as something that saved lives, as a strategic resource, as a mineral of power. But as the world moved into the industrial and modern age, salt revealed another face, one that people of the past never truly recognized: the face of the environment. If we look down at a coastal salt field in the afternoon light, we will see shimmering squares stretching out like fragments of a giant mirror. Seawater seeps through the mud, settles into the ponds, then evaporates under the sun, leaving behind a thin layer of white crystals. A scene so beautiful that many compare it to a lake shattered into countless pieces. But when the frame pulls back, that beauty comes with a difficult question. What happens to the environment when humans draw salt from the sea on an industrial scale? The truth is that seawater does not contain only salt. It holds hundreds of other minerals, microorganisms, and tiny ecosystems that rely on a fragile balance. When seawater is diverted into salt pans, when salt production expands relentlessly, coastal ecosystems change. In many places, the soil hardens from accumulated salt, plants cannot survive, and salty land spreads like a pale stain, subtle but irreversible. If we go deeper into coastal regions of China, Vietnam, or India, we can see rice fields that once fed families now transformed into dead land, uncultivable, unplantable. Salt seeps into soil the way water seeps into cloth. Once it enters, it is difficult to remove. Farmers watch their fields turn white after each season of sea winds and understand that nature is no longer what it once was. Salt also changes water. In many rivers and lakes near rock salt mining areas, salt concentrations rise so high that fresh water becomes brackish. Trees along the banks die, fish migrate elsewhere, algae blooms spread out of control. Black Lake in the United States once experienced such periods when mineral extraction made the water artificially salty. In regions like Israel and Jordan, lakes have shrunk because water flows were redirected to support salt production. A single day spent beside the Dead Sea makes this reality unmistakable. The Dead Sea recedes year by year, revealing more white salt flats and large sinkholes like open wells. People come here to take photos, to float on water thick as oil, yet few realize that its retreat signals an ecosystem being drained beyond its limits. Salt also changes the air, slowly but undeniably. In areas with large-scale salt production, salty vapor rises continuously, carrying tiny salt particles into the atmosphere. When these microscopic crystals float through the air, they can alter the nature of clouds and rain. Some coastal regions receive salty rain, so mild it can't be tasted, yet strong enough to slow plant growth. In the energy industry, salt leads a completely different life. Scientists discovered that molten salt stores heat exceptionally well. This makes it ideal for energy storage in concentrated solar power plants. In the solar towers rising from the deserts of Nevada or Andalusia, molten salt is kept in massive silver tanks glowing under the sun. By day, the salt absorbs heat. By night, it releases that heat to drive turbines. Thanks to this, solar energy is no longer limited by daylight. Salt, the mineral once used to preserve meat, has now become the mineral used to store energy. But this shift comes with new consequences. If molten salt leaks, it can scorch soil and destroy vegetation. Large solar plants require vast land areas, altering natural landscapes. Even when the goal is clean energy, the environmental footprint remains. Then there is desertification. Not every salty region is a desert, but wherever soil becomes excessively saline, deserts often follow. In Australia, tens of thousands of hectares of farmland have turned into white wastelands as salt rises from underground through water tables. In China, fertile coastal plains are being pushed back by layers of salt crust. Seedlings die the moment their roots touch the earth. Mature trees wither within months. Salt-driven desertification is the quietest form of desert. No strong winds, no sandstorms. It is a desert of 1,000 tiny wounds, accumulating slowly until the entire field loses its life. In the broader picture, salt becomes a sign of imbalance between humanity and the environment. Salt is not at fault. It simply does what nature programmed it to do. But when humans push salt out of its natural cycle, when production and consumption outpace the ecosystem's ability to absorb it, silent consequences appear. If we stand beside a vast salt field, say in Camargue in France or Marakanam in India, and watch the sunset glitter across the salt pans, we will see a beauty that is hard to resist. But that beauty always comes with a lingering question. Are we taking more from nature than nature can endure? Salt once helped humans survive hunger, cold, war, and scarcity. Now, salt is reminding us that the cost of convenience and large-scale production can erode the very environment we rely on. A small mineral, yet powerful enough to change the land, the water, and the air. The future always begins with very small things, a single strand of silver hair, a slower step, the first ray of dawn, and perhaps the future of humanity is also being written by things just as small, even the most familiar ones, like a grain of salt. A mineral that seems ancient, seems to have completed its historical cycle, somehow finds its way back in forms we have not entirely anticipated. If you stand on a coastal sand dune at sunrise, where the wind carries a faint salty scent, you can sense it. Salt does not belong only to the distant past of civilization. It is slipping quietly into new stories. Laboratories glowing white in Tokyo, solar deserts in California, food supply networks stretching from Mexico to Singapore. The future of salt no longer lies in the taste it leaves on the tongue, but in its ability to merge into the systems we are building. One of the clearest pathways is energy. In concentrated solar power plants, molten salt is now used as a kind of giant thermal battery. During the day, it absorbs sunlight and heat, storing energy within each phase change. At night, the salt releases that energy back into the turbine system, producing electricity without the sun. A mineral once used to preserve meat is now the material that may hold the future of clean energy. There is something both strange and beautiful in that transformation. Scientists are also studying how to use salt in high-temperature batteries, in ultra-efficient cooling systems, even in self-regulating construction materials. If these technologies become real, we could live in buildings that adjust themselves, in cities that run more sustainably, where salt exists not only on the dining table, but also in the walls, in the pipes, in the bricks that shimmer faintly with crystalline light. But salt is not moving only toward technology. It is returning as what it has always been, a mineral that can save lives. As climate change turns many regions saline, scientists are developing crops that can survive in salty soil. Salt-tolerant rice fields in the Mekong Delta, salt-tolerant wheat fields in Australia or India are proof that salt, once the enemy of agriculture, may become the guide for a new kind of farming, a kind of agriculture that accepts the world as it is changing instead of fighting against it. We are also seeing salt re-enter medical research, not as a culprit, but as an immune modulator. New studies show that moderate levels of salt can activate certain immune cells to function properly. The balance is fragile, of course, but it says something important. Salt is not the villain in the story of health. It is simply asking us to understand the body more deeply, to listen more carefully. In the food industry, the future of salt is a story of responsibility. The world consumes too much salt because industrial food depends on it, but that same world is trying to reduce it. Technologies for virtual saltiness, hollow salt crystals that reduce sodium while keeping flavor, and new seasoning techniques are emerging. The food industry is not trying to eliminate salt, because that is impossible. They are simply learning how to speak to salt in a new voice. Yet the future of salt also carries the shadow of environmental challenges. As sea levels rise, soil salinity increases. As soil becomes saline, agricultural migration begins. Fertile lands turn pale and barren. Rivers once drinkable turn brackish. Salt, in its quietest way, is reminding us that the Earth's balance is more fragile than we think. If you stand before a salt-stained rice field in the western provinces during the dry season, seeing white crystals glitter on the surface like dew that never melted, you will understand that the future of salt is also the future of climate. The two will continue to weave into one another, shaping questions our generation cannot avoid. But amid those anxieties, the future of salt is not a dark map. Because salt has always been a mineral of adaptation. Salt preserves, salt transforms, salt keeps what matters and lets go of what does not. Perhaps that is why in every era salt manages to find its place. There is a beautiful image, a grain of salt dissolving in water. In that moment, it loses its form, but does not disappear. It becomes part of something larger, of the sea, of the dish, of the human body. And perhaps that is the path of salt in the future, not to stand as the center of history, but to flow quietly into the great movements of humanity. The history of salt has passed through power, scarcity, war, religion, and science. Now it enters the future with its familiar quietness. In the spoon of salt in a home-cooked meal, in salt fields facing new pressures, in laboratories trying to turn salt into technology, in energy facilities using salt to hold the sun's light. And perhaps, just as it has for thousands of years, salt will continue to play a role we ourselves cannot yet fully predict. Because some minerals never leave the human story, they simply change the way they are told.